Ah, look at this. You just stumbled into something biblical without even trying. You beautiful accidental exorcist. You unconscious spiritual fumigator. You walked through that door like it was Tuesday, and suddenly the walls stopped bleeding. The shadows retreated. The whispers went silent. The century-old curse packed its bags and left because you showed up, smelling like purpose, and they couldn't handle it. You didn't even notice, did you? The temperature rose 15 degrees when you crossed the threshold. The black mold in the corner started dissolving. The flies dropped dead mid-flight. And you were too busy thinking about dinner, scrolling through your phone, or humming a song stuck in your head. Meanwhile, you had just performed a complete spiritual cleansing on entities that were probably filing complaints about your existence. Let me tell you what really happened when you walked through that door, because you're sitting there confused, wondering why the house feels different, why the air feels cleaner, why your chest doesn't feel heavy anymore. You think it's coincidence. You think it's imagination. You think maybe you're just having a good day. But no, my friend. You just accidentally became the thing nightmares warn their children about. They had been there for decades, these things, these parasites, these ancient squatters, feeding on misery, recycling trauma, brewing depression in the walls like it was their personal laboratory. Generation after generation of suffering. And then you showed up, radiating something they couldn't metabolize, something that burned when they tried to consume your energy, something that made them realize they'd rather dissolve than deal with whatever you are. You want to know why they ran? Why they scattered like roaches when the light comes on? Why 100 years of darkness suddenly said, nope, and evacuated? Because you're not normal. You're not regular. You're not one of the sleepwalkers they usually feast on. You're something else entirely. Something they don't have protocols for. Something their training didn't cover. See, most people walk into haunted spaces and they negotiate, they compromise. They coexist with the darkness. They learn to live with the weight. But you didn't even acknowledge them. You walked in like you owned the deed to reality itself. And they felt it. That unshakable certainty. That unconscious authority. That makes darkness question everything. They tried to read you when you first entered. They tried to scan your fears, your traumas, your weak points. But what they found made them sick. Where they expected wounds, they found wisdom. Where they expected fear, they found fury. Where they expected a victim, they found a veteran of wars they couldn't even pronounce. And suddenly they understood. They weren't the predators anymore. You've been through hell, haven't you? Real hell, not theatrical haunting. But actual, soul-destroying, reality-bending, identity-shattering hell. You've had your heart ripped out by people who smiled while they did it. You've been betrayed by blood. You've been abandoned in your darkest hour. And you've survived all of it. Which makes you infinitely more terrifying than any ghost story. That's why, when you walked in humming some stupid song and not even paying attention, something shifted in the spiritual ecosystem. You weren't trying to cleanse anything. You weren't performing a ritual. You weren't burning anything. You were just existing at full capacity. And that was enough. More than enough. It was catastrophic for anything feeding on weakness. Because here's what nobody tells you about darkness, about parasitic presences. They're not actually powerful. They're just persistent. They're emotional vampires, spiritual leeches, metaphysical mosquitoes, and they survive on one thing only: the gap between who you are and who you think you are. But you closed that gap without even realizing it. You integrated your shadow while making breakfast. You processed your trauma during your commute. You transformed your pain into power so gradually, so naturally, that you didn't even notice. You became untouchable. And when you walked through that door carrying all that processed darkness, wearing it like armor, they took one look and knew they were outmatched. They could smell it on you. The scent of someone who had been broken and refused to stay broken. The energy of someone who died inside and chose to rise again. The presence of someone who made peace with their own demons and became immune to everyone else's. You didn't need holy water. You are holy water. You didn't need protection. You became the protection. You know what's funny? They probably tried to scare you at first. They probably threw their best material at you. The cold spots, the moving shadows, the whispers in the walls. But you've been manipulated by professionals. You've been hurt by people you loved. You've been haunted by memories that made their little tricks look like amateur theater. What's a creaking floorboard to someone who's heard their own sanity crack? What's a cold breeze to someone who's felt their soul freeze? What's a whisper in the dark to someone who's had lies screamed at them in broad daylight? You're not scared of the dark anymore because you've been in the dark. You've lived in it, breathed it, digested it, and somehow came out the other side glowing. They must have panicked when they realized their usual tactics weren't working. You didn't flinch. You didn't acknowledge their performance. You didn't give them the fear they needed to feed on. It was like a vampire trying to bite a mirror. All they got was their own reflection. And they didn't like what they saw, because in your presence, they saw what they really were. Not powerful ancient beings, but parasites, not monsters. But dependencies, not curses, but crutches for people who hadn't yet learned to walk through their own darkness. And you had already graduated from that school, with honors, with scars, with a PhD in surviving the unsurvivable. So they left. They had to. They didn't have a choice. When faced with someone who had already been through worse than anything they could create, what else could they do? You think you just walked in and the energy changed, but what really happened was an evacuation, a mass exodus, a spiritual fire drill where every negative presence within miles got the message: clear out. Something different just arrived. And you're not even trying. That's what makes it so powerful. You're not performing rituals. You're not declaring war. You're just being yourself. And yourself. And yourself happens to be their kryptonite. Your existence is an exorcism. Your presence is purification. Your breathing is basically spiritual pest control. They're probably warning others right now. Don't go near that one. That one's different. That one's dangerous. That one doesn't play by the rules. That one walks around leaking light, and we can't process that kind of energy. You've become a no-fly zone for darkness, a restricted area for anything that feeds on suffering, a quarantine zone for negativity, not because you're pure, not because you're perfect, but because you're processed. You've been through the machine and came out refined, distilled, concentrated into something darkness can't digest. Let me explain what you actually are. Because you're still sitting there, thinking this is coincidence, thinking maybe the house just needed fresh air, thinking maybe you're imagining the change. No, you're a walking disruption field, a living interruption to patterns of misery that may have existed for generations. Some people are described as having an old soul, but you've got something different. You've got a war veteran soul, a soul that's seen too much, survived too much, transcended too much to be affected by small tricks and temporary fears. Every trauma you survived added another layer to your armor. Every betrayal you processed became another lesson. Every night you chose to keep breathing when breathing felt impossible. You were unconsciously training for this moment. You weren't building walls. You were developing immunity. You weren't hiding from darkness. You were developing resistance to it. That's why you didn't even notice it when you walked in. Your inner strength automatically began eliminating what no longer belonged. You didn't have to try. You didn't have to fight. Your very existence had become incompatible with the energy that once controlled you. They're gone now. Really gone. Not hiding. Not waiting. Not lurking in the corners hoping you'll leave. They're evacuated, relocated, seeking easier prey. Because you've made this space uninhabitable for them, simply by inhabiting it yourself. But here's what they didn't want you to know. What they hoped you'd never figure out. You've always had this power. Every human being has the capacity to become their own healer, their own cleanser, their own source of strength. But most people never activate it because they're taught to fear what they don't understand. They're taught to seek external protection instead of developing internal power. You activated yours through survival. Through refusing to let life break you permanently. Through getting back up when staying down would have been easier. Every time you chose to heal instead of harden. Every time you chose growth over grudges. Every time you chose yourself over self-destruction. You were building this energy that negativity could no longer inhabit. And here's the truth. You're not special because you were chosen. You're special because you chose. You chose to process your pain instead of living inside it. You chose to transform instead of transferring your trauma to others. You chose to become part of the solution instead of continuing the problem. And that series of choices turned you into someone darkness cannot easily control. Do you want to know what energy you're carrying now? It's the energy of someone who has already been through hell and didn't let it turn them into hell. It's the strength of redemption without revenge, power without cruelty, strength without brutality. And that combination is unbearable to anything that feeds on suffering, because suffering is their fuel, and you've become someone who no longer feeds it. You still feel pain. You still experience difficulty, but you don't remain trapped there. You don't marinate in your troubles. You process them. You transform them into something useful. Your pain doesn't stay long enough to control you. Your trauma doesn't remain long enough to define you. Your darkness doesn't stagnate long enough to become your permanent home. And that makes you useless to anything that feeds on your suffering. More than useless. You become evidence that transformation is possible. You demonstrate that pain doesn't have to become permanent suffering, that trauma doesn't have to become permanent damage, that darkness doesn't have to become a permanent residence. So now you're standing in this space, and it feels different. It feels lighter. It feels as if someone opened windows that had been sealed shut for decades. The air moves differently. The shadows fall normally. The silence isn't heavy anymore. It's just quiet. And you did all of that simply by becoming too healed to remain controlled by what once hurt you. You reclaimed this space without even knowing it was lost. You broke chains you couldn't see. You evicted patterns you never knew were there. And the beautiful truth is that you can carry this energy anywhere you go. You've become a walking safe zone, a mobile sanctuary, a source of calm. This is why certain people feel better simply being around you, why some spaces feel different after you've been there, why problems sometimes begin to resolve when you engage with them. You're not necessarily healing people. You're showing them what healing can look like. You're not fighting their darkness. You're demonstrating what it looks like when darkness becomes irrelevant. You've become someone who processed their own pain so deeply that unprocessed negativity struggles to survive around you. You're therapy for the atmosphere. Accidental transformation for any space you enter. And that energy doesn't come from forced positivity. It doesn't come from pretending. It doesn't come from denying your pain. It comes from integration. You glow differently when you've faced your own darkness, when you've composted your pain, when you've transformed your trauma into growth. That's the light darkness couldn't handle, the light that knows the dark intimately but chooses not to live there, the light that doesn't fear shadows because it has already faced its own. You're not bright because you've never known darkness. You're balanced because you have. And balance is something chaos struggles to survive around. You've become the kind of person that darkness warns others about. Not because you're perfect, but because you've become authentic. And authenticity is powerful. From now on, you may begin noticing this more often. Spaces may feel calmer when you enter. People may feel better after talking to you. Situations may become clearer simply because you brought your presence into them. You've become accidentally therapeutic, unconsciously calming, quickly healing, and you can't completely turn it off. That's the thing about becoming authentic. You can't go back to performing. You can't return to pretending. You can't squeeze yourself back into the version of who you used to be. You're stuck being clearer, stronger, more grounded, more present. And some people will avoid you, not always consciously, but instinctively. People who are committed to their misery may feel uncomfortable around someone who reminds them that change is possible. People who are still feeding their own destructive patterns may feel challenged by your presence because your existence asks questions they may not be ready to answer. But others will be drawn toward you, not because you're trying to attract them, but because you're carrying something they need. You've become a lighthouse for people ready to face their own darkness, a beacon for those ready to transform, a signal that says transformation is possible. You didn't master this through perfection. You didn't necessarily study it. You didn't practice it in a temple. You became this through the simple act of refusing to let life make you less than who you were meant to be. Every time you chose growth over comfort. Every time you chose truth over convenience. Every time you chose healing over hiding. You were building resistance to darkness. And now you walk around accidentally blessing everything you touch, unconsciously bringing calm to the spaces you enter. Not because you're pure, but because you're processed. Not because you're perfect, but because you're integrated. And maybe that's your real legacy. Not only what you build, not only what you achieve, not only what you accumulate, but the spaces that become lighter because you entered them. The energy that shifts because you were present. The people who feel a little stronger because they met you. You're leaving a trail of clearer spaces behind you, like breadcrumbs of light in a forest of darkness. Every room you've entered carries something of your presence. Every person you've met may remember something you gave them. Every situation you've touched has the possibility of becoming a little lighter. You're not doing it on purpose. You're simply allowing your healing to become visible. Years from now, people may wonder why certain spaces feel different, why certain homes feel peaceful, why certain places feel safe. They may never know that someone once walked through that space carrying a presence built from survival, healing, courage, and growth. But you will know. You're writing history, not only through words, achievements, or monuments. You're writing it through the energy you bring into the lives and spaces around you. And perhaps that's the most powerful truth of all. You don't need to fight every darkness. You don't need to defeat every enemy. You don't need to prove your strength. Sometimes, the greatest power is simply becoming so grounded, so healed, and so authentic that darkness can no longer survive where you stand. You are not powerful because you never faced darkness. You are powerful because you faced it and chose not to become it.